So thanks for having me today. Yeah, there's some really absolutely wonderful talks, and hoping I can continue that. So design systems for smaller organizations. If you have, like me, been in a team building a design system from its early stages, or you have been involved strategically at all, you've probably had discussions with people about viability and affordability. And something I've heard far too many times is this kind of notion that design systems are just this luxury for large organizations. And obviously, I get where people come from with this, right? Like larger teams and large companies have deep pockets and they can invest more time in it. But I disagree completely that it is purely a luxury for them. And hopefully I'm going to be able to convince you and explain why. So as I introduced myself earlier, I am Dan. I am working as UX engineering lead. I work for a company called Unit 4. We build a suite of kind of enterprise software, things for like finance and human resources and that sort of thing. Now, obviously, in what I've just said, some of you may have clocked that I said the word enterprise and that this talk is about smaller organizations. So prior to joining Unit 4, I'd spent the previous years working in startups / scale-ups. I never know when a startup becomes a scale-up, and working on design systems from the kind of ground up. And since moving into kind of the enterprise world, I've taken some time to reflect on the lessons I learned whilst I was in that kind of space. But lessons based on the successes, but I think more importantly, the failures, right? Like, I think it's really important that we embrace our failures and learn from them. And that's hopefully what I want to share with you today. So unsurprisingly, I'm going to start with stakeholder management. And I think pretty much every talk has kind of alluded to this in some way. We talk about it, we often use the term buy-in, and it's all about having one or hopefully more people who are above you and really believe in what you're doing and will champion this. So how do we achieve this in a smaller organization? Well, first we need to ask ourselves a question. Why are design systems great for smaller organizations in specifically? So obviously we all know the benefits of design systems. We've talked about many today, but what particularly about them is good for smaller organizations? Because if we can't answer that question, then we aren't going to be able to sell it as a valuable use of time and money. So for me, having reflected, I think there's two key areas where smaller companies can benefit. The first area is in prototyping. So we know that small organizations often don't know their market fit yet. They often have to test ideas. So maybe they build a new module, or maybe their whole product is kind of an experiment. And for me, that's where a design system can thrive, right? And often for startups, especially, if you look at their product offering from launch compared to, say, 2 or 3 years down the line, it can be completely different. So that ability to move fast and to adapt priorities is super important. And as we know, a design system can support that, and it can support it whilst delivering high quality. The other piece for me is how it optimizes tasks. So if you worked in a startup or a scale up, you'll know that like the hierarchy often inside the organization isn't that well defined. I don't mean there isn't hierarchy at all, but I mean, often you'll see situations where people in leadership positions will actually be doing part of the role of an IC, mucking in and kind of getting their hands dirty. And so when you've got this situation where people in leadership who should be organizing are actually doing some of the work and the company's moving fast, it can be really hard to coordinate efforts. And that's why and I guess this probably isn't just the problem for small organizations, but it's definitely kind of, I think, exacerbating that in that space, that you end up with teams repeating tasks, right? Teams building the same button, teams building the same pieces of UI repetitively. And that obviously in a smaller company, that's a big cost, because that's a big chunk of their wages being used repetitively. So if we can sell this, how can we make it succeed? Well, for me, I think the biggest learning is to agree a long-term vision. And I think this is to not only manage the stakeholders' expectations, but also to manage your own, because, you know, we tend meetups like this because we love design systems, but we've got to be realists. We've got to make sure that everyone is on the same page as where we're going, because if we've got this grandiose idea, but our stakeholders don't, then that lack of alignment will just cause frustration further down the line. And there's plenty of techniques for doing this. In a startup, I think the two kind of options are, you look at, okay, well, what if the organization was, say, 3 times the size? What sort of design system, what sort of team would be needed to support that, and work your way backwards? Alternatively, startups that go through funding rounds, you could think in that way as well. Probably the biggest thing I learned is that once you've agreed that vision, to write it down. It's very easy in these companies to kind of have meetings, have conversations, and because there might not be many of you, it's very easy to assume, right? Think it's been discussed, everyone was in that meeting, assume, but things can change over time. Leadership can change, resources can change, and priorities can change. It doesn't mean that when you create a long-term vision, it has to be set in stone. It's more just, it gives a reference point that you can keep coming back to, and just ensuring that everyone's on the same page with where you are and where you're going. So what should this look like? Firstly, unsurprisingly, resourcing and hiring. If you've been involved in a design system from an early stage, you've probably been told, oh, is this something you can do alongside your normal work? And I think all of the 3 talks have said, alluded to this. No, it doesn't work. Often when that happens, and someone else has then the conflict of product work versus design system work, the product work will always win out. And that's not for that's not for any like malice intent. It just is the truth. And what it means for the design system is it won't get the same attention it needs when it comes to governance. And Dan said it as well, that governance is super important. And I found it especially so when you're in those early stages of building a design system and trying to get the wheels rolling. So secondly, is agreeing a roadmap. And I've seen a few times that when I've had discussions around this, people tend to focus on the quantity, how many components, how many tokens, how many components. And for me, I don't find that works very well. I think what's more important is to go back to that piece around like the buy-in and the value that we add into the company, and focus the roadmap around that. It's quite tricky to do, and that's why it goes kind of hand in hand with the next piece I was saying, which is about metrics, right? It's very important that, and leadership will be very, very on your tail about this from experience, that metrics are super important to be able to actually prove that, the value you've said you add and what you're going to do will actually deliver what you're promising. So for me, there's 2 elements of this. There's the successes and the failures. So when you have successes and your metrics can prove that, shout about it, sing about it. It's wonderful when that happens. But equally, when you have failures, it's important to turn those to your advantage, right? Don't hide from them. The worst thing you can do from it is hide from them. It's important to know when something isn't working, to embrace it and actually show that you're being proactive and moving onwards from it. So the next thing I want to touch on is advocacy. As we all know, like, we love design systems, and if you work in a design system team, it can be a little bit of a bubble. It's so important to have advocacy. By that we mean people around the business who are also spreading the love and believe in what you're doing. And this is so important to its success. Often when we talk about others in a business being involved in the design system, we tend to go towards the notion of contribution. But oddly, and actually quite surprisingly to me, I found that adoption was more important, especially in those early stages. having a design system that is being used and used throughout a product, it really, really increases its value to the company. Because if someone in a leadership position wanted to ditch the design system, it would suddenly produce a lot of design and technical debt, which is much less likely to happen. So for me, having fewer components initially, but having that greater adoption is much, much better than having a suite of components that are just sat there gathering dust. And it kind of goes to supply and demand, right? If you have less and people are using it heavily, that will create and generate demand for more. And it's a good way, it's a good then selling point onwards to leadership to say, we need more people. So yeah, rather than that notion of completeness, I think it's important to prioritize what the users actually need. So for me, like, ambition is important, and having the ambition of not being the loudest voice for your design system. You will be the most knowledgeable person and the most passionate about it, but it really, really supports your cause if in meetings, especially meetings you might not be in, if others are there singing the praises of your design system. Because interestingly, when you're singing its praises, you might be seen as a little biased. But if someone someone unexpected, it does happen that you might find an engineer or a product owner who you weren't expecting actually really singing its design system praises. And that is super beneficial. All this though, all this kind of wonderful utopia relies on trust in yourself or your team, and also in the design system. And trust is such a difficult thing to build up, but it's a very, very easy thing to lose. Breaking changes, whether that be in your Figma design kit or whether that be in your code base, can really, really tarnish a person's opinion of your system. So, if they perceive it as slowing them down, that is instantly going to put them on the back foot and make them think that they question the value you're giving. So we need to think of ways and look for ways to obviously prevent this. I found that focusing on the interface was a very powerful technique. So what do I mean by this? So in Figma and in our kind of UI design kits, I'm talking about the naming of the components and the variants you supply. And in code, obviously, if we're talking something like React, we're talking about the component names and the props, or CSS, the class names. Why this is important is because if you've got a really solid interface, what you put behind it can be a bit naff, right? It's okay for it to be a bit naff and obviously not awful, but it's okay for it to be a little bit basic, maybe missing a few features that you can iterate on and add with time. But if you don't nail that down, it's much harder, again, going back to the notion of breaking changes. It's really, really important, obviously, to seek regular feedback. It's not just for design systems, this is any design, right? And any piece of work we do, like feedback is important. But from my experience in a small company, it's important to listen and to be really malleable in terms of that roadmap. So what I was saying about like the number of components, to me, that isn't important. What your users need, and actually listening and responding, it will really, really build that trust. And thirdly, involving others in your decision making. So those that might not even actually be the ones singing about your design system, bring them in, get their feedback, and involve them in decision making process. And again, document those decisions. It will really show the trust, right? Because it will show that the trust is going both ways, that they can have trust in you and that you have trust in them to make decisions about something that they might, obviously will perceive you as being more knowledgeable about. And so the third piece I want to touch on is education. And for me personally, the biggest problem I came across working on design systems in smaller companies is the definition of what a design system is. We've had a few people talking tonight and some really, really good metaphors, actually. I love the metaphor of kind of like the recipes and such. But I've had several conversations with people who have tried to tell me, a design system is just a bunch of UI. It's just a bunch of UI components. And as we know, there's a lot more to it than that. So how can we solve this problem? especially in a small organization where people's time is quite stretched and quite limited already without adding to their load. Now, the obvious choice that people will probably jump to is workshops and talks. And I don't want to discourage people from doing these because I think they are really powerful tools. But what I found, and I know I am fully aware of the irony of giving a talk, saying that talks probably aren't the best routes to exchange knowledge. But those who attend inside your organization are likely to be people who are already knowledgeable and already passionate or care in some way about your design system. It's quite likely that you may not reach the people that you need to. And actually, when people need to go and, people will have competing things for their time in terms of what they can and how much time they can give up. So for me, what I found much more powerful was the notion of pairing, or in larger groups, mobbing. So there's two ways you can do this, right? You can bring people into you and support them and pair alongside them. This can be on design, engineering, or even across the crafts. So you bring them in, you help them to contribute, and then hopefully, the idea hopefully is that they can go out when they work on their products and will sing your praises and will spread and increase the adoption. The problem is, it goes back to that thing of competing priorities for me, that I found that people often won't then push it as hard as they possibly could. And there's no judgment to them. Obviously, like small organization, they have pressures on them to deliver product. So personally, I found the notion of kind of me stepping over the fence and supporting in the product itself much more powerful. Again, it builds trust that you're willing to come over the fence. And it's, it does sound contradictory to the points we've made today about a design system needs to be staffed if I'm saying step away from it and help build the product. But it requires pragmatism in a small company. When you haven't got that level of resource, you do at times have to be really pragmatic to be able to drive that more demand. And as I said, it doesn't have to be limited to craft. You can support design, you can support engineering, you can support product. And the only thing I will say to that is just be prepared to manage the kind of expectations and be clear about the limits of what your support is. You don't want to make them think that you are full-time now an engineer or a designer with them, but set the limit, say, hey, I'm coming to support you on X or Y for this period of time. And it will really help to pass on the knowledge, not only about the design system, but also about UI in general and about the kind of technical side of what we do. So I said those 3 points, but again, I think I can't remember who's talking, but I'm going to a fourth point as well. And it kind of points back to that notion of pragmatism, right? It's probably the main attribute you'll need to have to be really pragmatic and understand kind of which hill to die on. We all know what the best practices are for design systems, but it's likely you will have to compromise at times because, and this, I'm going to sound really negative here and really defeatist, but I'm trying to be really realistic, that most folks in leadership won't care about the design system, not to the level we do, and not to the level we would need them to allow for the full scope. So one realization I had is that it's kind of okay if the version 1 of your design system sucks. Like in a startup and scale up, as I said, the product itself may not be that well defined. So it's okay if the design system for that product is not that well defined as well. And if you look at some of the big boys that we all aspire to, Polaris, Carbon, Material, none of them are on their first version. They are many iterations down the line, and it would have taken them a long time. I think, as Dan said, it's not easy, and they would have done a lot of ugly things to get to that point. And I'm a big fan of this. There's this sort of phrase that's been used and turned many times. It's not an Italian proverb. The best is the enemy of the good, and it's sometimes referred to as like the 80-20 rule. And it's the idea that if you strive for everything, you will maybe achieve nothing, right? You really need to think about, okay, and it's that notion of agile and MVP, right? That notion of what can we achieve and what can then we use to build on that. So it might be an unpopular opinion in an environment like this, in a group like this, but maybe it's okay if all your design tokens aren't defined, right? Like maybe it's okay if you use a framework of some kind as a base initially. Like if your users give you, as in by users, I mean like an engineers and designers, if they say, hey, we're quite used to Bootstrap or Tailwind, it's probably okay to use that in your initial versions, just to get the adoption and to get them on board. So I just wanted to leave a few final thoughts, and I really don't want to end on a down note, but I think it's important to reiterate the importance of pragmatism and realism. If you are working in a small company, or are moving to a small company and want to kind of build a design system, it is very much achievable, but it's not easy. It's very hard work. And one thing I learned is that it's important not to get too emotionally invested. We are here again because we love design systems. That's why I attend meetups like this and Converge next week. But for our mental well-being, for our happiness, it's important that we do treat it as work, because, as I said, things can change within a company. Priorities can change. Leadership can change. It's quite likely in the downsizing that a design system team may be seen as a target to go. So you need to be prepared to walk away if it's the right thing for you. Burnout has been a huge problem in our industry over the last few years, and I guess this probably could be a bit of advice for anything really. But I think it's really important that if you are in that space for your mental well-being, for your mental health, that you are able to keep that distance and do what you do. By the way, I'm not advocating you quit your jobs here. That's not what I'm saying. It's purely about looking after yourselves. So on that happy note, thank you very much. I don't do many of the socials, but feel free if you have any questions, obviously to ask me QA or to add me on LinkedIn or some of the design systems Slack communities. Thank you very much.